In World War II, survival didn't always come from weapons or training. Sometimes it came from a button sewn inside a collar, a piece of string in a boot, or a shard of mirror hidden behind a photo. These weren't issued, they weren't listed, but they were carried quietly, deliberately, and often desperately. Soldiers didn't talk about them, because they weren't meant to be talked about. They were meant to work when everything else failed. These 7 items didn't win battles. They bought time. They bought warmth. They bought life one more night, one more breath, one more silent chance to endure. You won't find them in museums. But without them, many wouldn't have made it home. Today, we're revealing the survival items World War II soldiers carried and never spoke about. Hit like and subscribe to preserve the quiet knowledge that war left behind. Number 1, pencil stub for messages and maps. In war, paper vanished quickly, but one object stayed close, buried deep in cloth, worn smooth by nervous hands. A pencil. Not a full one, just a stub, 2 inches, maybe less. Graphite wrapped in splintered wood, flattened at both ends. It was small enough to lose, but too important to let go. That stub wasn't for journals or poetry. It was for drawing escape routes from memory, for tracing patrol paths into the dust, for scratching coded warnings onto the back of tin plates. A single mark, made quietly, could mean the difference between capture and freedom. In silence, it spoke. No questions, no risk of being overheard, just pressure against metal, wood, or dirt. An invisible language only the desperate understood. Captured soldiers used it to track days without food, to record which guards rotated night shifts, to mark the one tree that rustled when wind passed, revealing the softest spot in the fence. One American pilot carried his pencil stub inside a hollowed matchbox, hidden under wax paper. At night, he marked silhouettes of aircraft on the inside flap, memorizing every curve, every engine sound. Not because he'd fly again, but because remembering felt like resistance. Another prisoner in Stalag Luft 3 hid his stub inside the shaft of a toothbrush. Each night, using the dim light of the moon, he added faint lines to a cloth scrap, his escape tunnel diagram, growing quietly, stitch by stitch, behind a false wall. The pencil didn't shout. It whispered. A single word on a spoon handle could warn a cellmate. A quick mark on a stone could reroute a patrol. Even initials scrawled into wood meant someone had lived, observed, endured. When it wore down, soldiers split it, wrapped the pieces in cloth, sharpened it with metal scraps. If it broke completely, they turned to soot, dirt, burnt twigs, but nothing worked like graphite. It was light, silent, concealable, and it made the unseen visible. This stub was never issued. It wasn't regulation, but soldiers carried it like a weapon, because sometimes survival depended more on memory than muscle. Not every soldier fired a shot, but many left behind a message, one forgotten item, one more day remembered. Number 2, mirror shard for signaling. It was smaller than a playing card, sharp at the edges, smudged at the surface, and carefully wrapped in cloth or cardboard. A broken mirror shard. Not for vanity, not for grooming, for survival. Soldiers didn't carry it to see themselves. They carried it to be seen, when everything else made them invisible. In dense forests, across frozen plains, and behind enemy lines, movement meant risk. But reflection? That was precision. With the sun as their partner, soldiers used a mirror's glint like a silent flare. Brief flashes aimed skyward, each one a pulse of hope. Air crews knew what to look for. A quick, unnatural flicker in the wilderness. 1 flash for location, 2 for confirmation, 3 meant distress. All this with no sound, no signal fires, no smoke trails that could give away position. Some shards were cut intentionally, others came from wreckage, a truck mirror shattered by gunfire, a mess kit polished to reflect. They didn't need to be pretty, just enough to bounce sunlight at the right angle. Even inside prison camps, mirror shards played their part. Smuggled under clothing, stitched into false seams, or hidden in shaving kits, they became tools for watching guards, scanning blind corners, or checking behind without turning your head. A French resistance courier once kept a mirror fragment inside her boot. When she passed information between camps, she used it to watch who followed, signaling her handler from across the yard with a twitch of light through a crack in the wall. In POW escape tunnels, these shards reflected not light, but coordination. One man watched from inside while another dug. The reflection was used to communicate progress, danger, and when to stop. It became the eyes behind you when turning around wasn't possible. The mirror didn't speak, but it warned. It coordinated. It called out across silence and distance. No one issued it. No one logged it. But those who had one held onto it tightly, not for themselves, but for the chance to be found. It wasn't glass. It was signal. It was safety. It was connection, cut and carried in a world trying to forget you existed. One forgotten item. One more day remembered. If you know of any survival item or story that's been lost to time, drop it in the comments. Sometimes the smallest details carry the loudest truths. Number 3. Thread and needle for repairs. It doesn't sound like much. A needle, a few feet of thread, rolled tight, tucked into a boot, a helmet lining, or the seam of a jacket. But this wasn't for comfort. It was survival, folded, hidden, and carried through the filth of war. Because when gear broke, no one handed you a replacement. Jackets tore during crawls through barbed wire. Packs ripped under snow and weight. Boots split open after weeks of frost and fire. If a soldier waited for help, he froze. If he didn't repair, he bled. So they learned, quietly, quickly, to stitch. It wasn't about neatness. It was about function. Some used fishing line for durability. Others unraveled socks, rewinding the strands. Bent nails became makeshift needles. Bone fragments were sharpened into points. They didn't need to look pretty. They just had to hold. Inside POW camps, thread did more than mend uniforms. It stitched hope. Prisoners used it to hide items, sewing double layers into jackets where maps, food, or flints could be stashed. Others passed coded messages between seams, trusting a needle to carry secrets where voices couldn't. In one German camp, an escaped prisoner was caught, not because of a tunnel, but because a missing stitch on his borrowed coat gave him away. That one detail told guards he didn't belong. After that, every man learned to sew, like his life depended on it. Because it did. Even wounds were closed in silence. When medics were gone and supplies had vanished, soldiers used thread to suture cuts. No anesthesia, no antiseptic. Just grit, steel, and instinct. One thread, one jab at a time. Infection was a risk, but bleeding out was certain. Some kept thread wound around buttons, others inside pen barrels. One story tells of a man who braided it into a bracelet, snipping pieces as needed. Nobody noticed. That was the point. It wasn't issued by command. It wasn't written into survival manuals. But in foxholes and fences, that thread reconnected a world unraveling at the seams. What looked like a civilian item carried a soldier through war. One forgotten item, one more day intact. If you know of a soldier's secret tool that helped them survive, share it in the comments. Sometimes the smallest items tell the biggest stories. Number 4. Button compass. It looked like any other button. 4 holes, black or brass, sewn onto a standard issue coat, but hidden inside some of those buttons was something no soldier was supposed to talk about: direction. Because when maps were burned and stars were clouded, this small object became the only guide left. A compass built into a button, disguised so perfectly that not even a seasoned officer could tell the difference without breaking it open. These weren't carried by chance. They were issued in secret to paratroopers, special operatives, and pilots flying over enemy lines. But many were smuggled into POW camps, stitched into civilian clothes, or passed between prisoners like treasure. The needle was magnetized steel, balanced, precise, but fragile. A tiny red mark pointed north. Soldiers would remove the button, place it on a leaf, float it in water, and watch it spin, revealing the only information that truly mattered: a way out. The Allies knew escape would depend not just on courage, but on quiet technology. So they hid it where no one would search. Prisoners in Colditz and Stalag Luft III memorized the feel of that button. Some sewed decoys next to it. Others scratched dots into fabric around it to remember orientation in total darkness. If you were caught with one, punishment was severe. But if you didn't have one, escape was nearly impossible. One British pilot, captured in Holland, broke his own compass button before interrogation, hiding the magnetized pieces inside a bar of soap. Days later, he reassembled it and escaped across a frozen river, following that tiny needle until it brought him to Allied lines. But these compasses weren't just for escape. They were mental anchors. For men trapped behind wire for years, direction was hope. Knowing where home was, even without roads, gave them something to hold on to. A goal, a reason to count steps, a reason to keep moving in their minds, even when their bodies couldn't. Sometimes the buttons never left the coat. Sometimes they were lost in soil. But when they worked, when the sky opened, and silence allowed one small plan to unfold, they became more than metal. They became escape routes wrapped in cloth. No orders required, no explanation given, just one more silent tool carried for the day freedom returned. One forgotten item, one more path home. Number 5, safety pin or wire loop. On paper, it was useless. A thin piece of bent metal, no larger than a matchstick, fragile, cheap, and forgettable. But in the hands of a World War II soldier, a safety pin or a simple wire loop became one of the most adaptable survival tools in the field. These weren't carried for emergencies. They were used every day. Gear broke constantly. Straps tore under weight. Belts loosened in mud. Zippers jammed after rain. Soldiers couldn't stop moving, and they couldn't wait for replacements. So they fixed everything on the go with whatever they had. A safety pin kept canteen straps from falling loose. It reattached rifle slings mid-march. It held down loose bandages when medics weren't near. One pin could secure a sleeve to stop it catching in machinery. Another could fasten a backpack flap tight to keep out snow or dust. Wire loops served similar purposes. Soldiers shaped them to create makeshift latches for ammo crates. Some used them as hooks to pull hot mess kits from fires. Others bent them into locks, binding crates shut during transport to keep supplies dry and secure. Nothing about these tools looked impressive, but their reliability earned them space in every pocket. Soldiers didn't think of them as optional. They were standard, unofficial, unspoken, but irreplaceable. When parachutes needed quick refolding under fire, pins helped anchor fabric. When uniforms tore along seams, a wire loop held it together just long enough to stay warm through a freezing patrol. Even weapon components, tiny springs or clips, were sometimes temporarily replaced using bent wire pulled from fencing or ration cans. The field didn't wait for a solution. Soldiers made one. One U.S. infantryman marching through Italy used a bent safety pin to bypass a broken trigger guard latch, not as a weapon emod, but to keep the weapon closed. That fix held for days until resupply arrived. Another kept 2 pins on his dog tags, not for decoration, but to reset the firing pin on his sidearm if jammed. These items didn't save lives in a dramatic moment. They preserved function. They bought time. And in war, time is survival. No ceremony marked their use. No recognition came after. But when everything else was failing, a pin in the right place meant the mission continued. And so did the man carrying it. One forgotten item. One more step forward. Number 6, photographs folded in oil paper. Some soldiers carried knives. Others carried letters. But the one thing nearly all of them carried was a photograph. Not in frames, not in albums, just a small, worn picture folded tightly inside a piece of oil paper, protected from water, hidden from damage, carried close to the body where no one could take it away. It wasn't just sentiment, it was survival. A single image, a wife holding a child, a family standing by a doorway, a friend in uniform, could pull a soldier back from the edge when nothing else could. The oil paper served a purpose. It kept the photo dry during storms, preserved the ink during marches, and shielded it from sweat, mud, and snow. Many used waxed ration wrappers or trimmed pieces from waterproof maps. Some folded the image so many times the creases nearly erased the face. Still, they held on to it. Because in a war where silence was standard and death could come without warning, the photograph reminded them who they were before the uniform. It was the one piece of home that didn't need translation. Men would check the photo during downtime, not out of comfort, but discipline, to remind themselves of what waited beyond the trenches. Not every soldier had faith in victory, but many had faith in memory, and that was enough. Photographs also served a functional role. Some soldiers wrapped extra items inside them, like matches, pressed herbs, or coded messages, protected by the oil paper and folded into shirt linings. Others used the stiff fold to press leaves or notes flat inside their packs. But the image itself was always the priority. In freezing camps, when hands went numb and thoughts blurred, just holding that tiny bundle of paper gave men a reason to keep moving. One soldier fighting through the Ardennes carried a torn photo of his mother's kitchen table. Just the corner of it. No faces. But that table meant warmth. And in that snow-covered forest, warmth meant everything. Another infantryman in North Africa kept a photo of his old workshop. Not the people, just the tools on the wall. Because those tools reminded him of precision, of purpose, of a life that made sense before everything broke apart. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was navigation through chaos, through exhaustion, through fear. That photo, protected in oil paper, was more than a keepsake. It was armor of the mind, a line back to self when the world had turned to noise. And if it ever fell out of a pocket, they'd search until dark to find it. Because in a place where nothing was certain, that one square of memory never changed. One forgotten item. One more reason to return. If you know of any small keepsake that helped a soldier hold on, share it in the comments. Some stories don't fade. They just wait to be remembered. Number 7. Waxed matches. There was one thing every soldier feared more than bullets at night. The cold. And when temperatures dropped below freezing, wet matches became dead weight. That's why the smartest soldiers carried a tiny, waterproof miracle, waxed matches, or a flint strip, hidden and protected like gold. They weren't issued with fanfare. You wouldn't find them listed on any official kit. But the men who had seen a fire go out in sleet, who'd watched comrades shiver uncontrollably in a trench, knew one truth. Fire was life. Waxed matches were hand-prepared. Soldiers dipped standard matches in candle wax or paraffin one by one, letting them dry and harden. Some wrapped them in foil, others sealed them in layers of cloth or slipped them inside brass tubes. It wasn't beautiful work, it was instinct. And it worked. Even when soaked by rain, these matches struck clean. One spark, one flick, enough to light a stove, dry socks, warm numb fingers, or boil water when illness hovered nearby. Flint strips offered another advantage. They were reusable, reliable, and nearly impossible to ruin. Tucked into belt loops, stitched beneath collars, or tied behind dog tags, these small tools could outlast the war itself. Soldiers struck them with blades, metal buckles, even ration cans, anything that could scrape a spark into dry tinder. But it wasn't just about warmth. Fire meant cooking. Fire meant signaling. Fire meant sterilizing a blade in the field when nothing else was clean. Soldiers learned to use bark, twine, paper, dried leaves, whatever burned, to extend those precious flames. One match wasn't just one light. It was 10 minutes of survival. Some kept the matches inside spent bullet casings. Others rolled them inside socks. One trick passed between soldiers involved hollowing out the wooden grip of a sidearm and lining it with a strikeable strip, making the pistol handle a fire starter without anyone noticing. These weren't gimmicks, they were contingency plans. Because when fuel ran out, when rain soaked every layer of clothing, when winds howled through broken windows and collapsed bunkers, what mattered wasn't how strong a man was. It was how prepared he stayed. And one waxed match could turn a deadly night into a survivable one. It could dry the inside of a coat before frostbite set in. It could brew bitter tea that fought off infection. It could light the fuse on a final flare when the world had gone dark. No officer demanded men carry them. No manual explained how to make them. But soldiers passed the knowledge anyway, quietly, urgently, like something too valuable to lose. They didn't carry fire. They carried the chance to make it. One forgotten item, one more night survived. If you know of any improvised tool soldiers used to fight cold or stay alive, share it in the comments. Survival lived in the smallest sparks. They never bragged about these things. You won't find waxed matches or pencil stubs in museums. No general wrote speeches about thread, flint, or folded photographs. But these were the objects that held men together when everything else was falling apart. Because in war, it wasn't always bullets that decided who lived. It was who carried warmth in a frozen field, who stitched a boot instead of letting it rot, who struck a spark when the night was long and the rations were gone. These weren't survival tricks, they were lifelines, passed in silence, protected with care and buried in pockets where no one could steal them. The men who carried these tools didn't talk about them when they came home. They didn't need to. Their silence was proof. But now the silence is breaking. If you've watched this far, you understand. Real survival isn't loud. It's deliberate. It's precise. And sometimes it's just one thread, one photo, one forgotten match away from being lost forever. So help keep these memories alive. Like this video, share it with someone who still values quiet resilience, and subscribe, because this history doesn't live in books. It lives in the tools they never let go.